In the darkness of your screen, another nightmare awaits. Welcome to Void of Fears. We've conquered 10k, but the shadows grow hungry for more. Our journey to 100k subscribers has begun. Every like feeds the algorithm. Every comment summons new victims. Every subscription strengthens what we're building here. Join us. Shape our future. The Void has room for all. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. The first time I heard it, I was alone. That's the part that still haunts me. No witnesses, just me, Dr. Mara Ellison, sitting at my terminal at 2:37 a.m, monitoring routine data packets from the Prometheus VII deep space probe. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in NASA's Deep Space Network facility, casting harsh shadows across my workstation. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, the bitter dregs reminding me I'd been at this for nearly 14 hours straight. Everyone else had gone home to their normal lives, unaware that tonight would change everything. I rubbed my eyes, fighting fatigue as I scanned the incoming telemetry. Prometheus VII was our most ambitious probe yet, sent to explore the outermost boundaries of our solar system, equipped with sensors more sensitive than anything we'd launched before. 6 years of travel to reach its destination, and now it was sending back data from regions of space humanity had never observed directly. The stream of data was normal. Cosmic radiation readings, gravitational measurements, the usual background noise of space, until it wasn't. The pattern changed. Subtly at first, like a whisper beneath the static. Then, more distinct, organized, purposeful. I sat up straight, fatigue forgotten. The monitor displayed a waveform unlike anything I'd seen in 15 years of signal analysis. It pulsed with an internal rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. I ran a standard algorithmic analysis, expecting to see random fluctuations explained away by instrument error or cosmic interference. Instead, the analysis revealed structures too ordered to be natural, patterns within patterns, self-referential sequences that built upon themselves with impossible precision. My training in cryptanalysis and signal decryption kicked in immediately. This wasn't random. Random doesn't repeat with such precision. Random doesn't adjust when it encounters interference, maintaining its integrity across vast distances. Random doesn't respond. But this did. When I adjusted our receiver array to focus more clearly on the anomaly, the signal strengthened, as if grateful for the attention, as if it knew it was being watched and responded in kind. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I watched the waveform synchronize with our scanning frequency, matching it, mirroring it, then subtly altering it in ways that seemed almost playful. I checked and rechecked the equipment, searching for a malfunction, a cross signal, anything to explain what I was seeing. Everything functioned perfectly. The signal was real, and it was coming from the edge of our solar system. My fingers hovered over the emergency protocols button. This was precisely the kind of discovery that warranted waking up the entire department, but something held me back. An irrational desire to understand this myself first, to have just a few more minutes alone with this impossible thing. I shouldn't have hesitated. After 20 minutes of observation, I finally called Dr. Hastings from the adjacent lab. He arrived bleary-eyed 15 minutes later, annoyed at being disturbed until he saw the visualization on my monitor. His irritation vanished instantly. "That's impossible," he whispered, leaning closer to the screen. "It's modulating, adapting." The waveform pulsed, its pattern shifting like a heartbeat, or a countdown. Each pulse seemed more complex than the last, carrying information that our systems couldn't fully decode but hinted at vast complexity. "We need to call Director Vex," I said, reaching for the secure line. Hastings nodded, still staring at the screen, transfixed. I turned away to dial, and when I looked back, blood was streaming from his nose, a sudden crimson river down his lab coat. His hands trembled as he tried to wipe it away, leaving scarlet smears across his face. "Peter." I stood alarmed, but frozen in place. His eyes met mine, then slowly rolled back, revealing bloodshot whites. His body began to convulse, and he whispered 3 words before collapsing to the floor. "It sees us." I dropped the phone and rushed to him, desperately trying to remember my emergency medical training as he seized on the cold laboratory floor. His body went rigid, then limp. By the time the medical team arrived, he was unresponsive, though still breathing. As they wheeled him away, I returned to my station, hands shaking. The signal continued its rhythmic pulse on my monitor, unchanged, indifferent to the human drama it had just caused. I stared at it, feeling something I couldn't name, a mixture of dread and terrible fascination. That was day 53. Before we understood what was coming, before we knew that the countdown had already begun. The next morning found me in Director Lionel Vex's office, a windowless room buried 4 levels beneath NASA headquarters. I hadn't slept. The image of Hastings collapsing replayed whenever I closed my eyes. When I arrived, security protocols had been heightened. Retinal scans, voice authentication, armed guards at checkpoints I'd never seen guarded before. Vex stood behind his desk when I entered, a digital display illuminating his face from below. The bags under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept either. His normally immaculate appearance was disheveled, tie loosened, shirt wrinkled. He wasn't alone. Dr. Ellison, meet Dr. Reza Mallory from astrophysics, and Dr. Irene Kwan, our leading exobiologist, Vex said, gesturing to the 2 figures seated across from his desk. Mallory was tall, thin, with prematurely silver hair and fingers that never stopped moving, tapping sequences on his knee, adjusting his glasses, fidgeting with a pen. A brilliant mind notorious for thinking 5 steps ahead of everyone else. I'd read his papers on exotic matter, but never met him in person. Kwan sat perfectly still by contrast, her posture military straight, eyes sharp and evaluating. Her reputation preceded her, the researcher who revolutionized our understanding of how life might develop in non-Earth environments. She wore no makeup, her black hair pulled back severely, nothing to distract from her analytical gaze. "I've briefed them on the basics," Vex said, "but they need to see it firsthand." "Show them," Vex instructed, his voice tight. I connected my secure drive to his system and pulled up the recording of the signal on the wall display. The room darkened automatically as the visualization appeared, a pulsing, flowing pattern that seemed to breathe across the screen. I played it back at 1/4 speed, then 1/8. Even slower, the pattern remained too complex to fully comprehend, but its intentional nature was undeniable. "This came from the edge of our solar system?" Mallory asked, stepping closer to the display, his restless hands finally still. "From Prometheus VII? "Yes," I confirmed, advancing through different visualizations I'd prepared overnight. The probe was passing the heliosphere boundary when it detected this. Initial analysis suggests it's not electromagnetic in nature, at least not entirely. It seems to exist across multiple spectrums simultaneously. "Fascinating," Mallory whispered. "The complexity suggests something beyond algorithmic generation. This isn't a beacon or automated message." Kwan hadn't moved from her seat, but her eyes hadn't left the display either. "And Hastings?" she asked. Her voice was surprisingly gentle for someone with such intense eyes. Vex pulled up a medical file on a separate screen. Stable but unresponsive. Brain activity off the charts. Patterns we've never seen before. He's in a coma-like state, but with unprecedented neural firing across all regions of the brain. I shivered, remembering his final words. He was only exposed for minutes, less than 30. We were following standard first contact protocols for signal analysis. "Which is why this stays contained," Vex said firmly, closing the medical file. "Prometheus VII has been redirected to continue gathering data, but all transmissions now route through an isolated buffer system. You three will work together to determine what we're dealing with. If it's communication, we need to understand it. If it's a threat..." He let the sentence hang unfinished. "I've never seen anything like this," Quan admitted, finally standing to approach the visualization. "It resembles neither biological patterns nor known communication structures, yet it clearly contains intent." "How long do we have?" Mallory asked, his fingers resuming their restless movement. Vex hesitated, glancing at me. I nodded slightly, confirming he should share everything. He pulled up another display, a simulation showing the signal's point of origin and its trajectory through our solar system. A path of pulsing light moving inexorably towards the third planet from the sun. "Whatever is generating this signal is moving toward Earth," he said quietly. "At its current speed, it arrives in 52 days. Silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. Then Quan spoke, her voice clinical, detached. "Is this being shared with other agencies, other countries?" "Not yet," Vex replied. "The National Security Council is meeting tonight to determine next steps. For now, this remains classified at the highest level." "That's a mistake," Mallory interjected. "Something of this magnitude requires global cooperation. We need the best minds worldwide working on this." "And cause a panic," Vex countered. "We don't even know what this is yet." "Which is precisely why we need help," Mallory insisted. I watched them argue, the enormity of our situation settling onto my shoulders. 52 days until... what? First contact? Invasion? Extinction? My stomach twisted as I remembered Hastings' last words. "It sees us." We were given an isolated lab in the facility's east wing, a space I hadn't known existed until that day. Triple redundant security, air-gapped systems, and specific protocols for signal exposure. No one person could study the raw data for more than 30 minutes before taking a mandatory break. Medical staff monitored our vitals constantly, blood samples twice daily. The first week was frustrating. We approached it from our respective disciplines, my cryptographic algorithms, Mallory's astrophysical models, Quan's biological pattern recognition, but the signal defied conventional analysis. Mallory developed a theory that it might be a form of advanced gravitational wave communication using space-time itself as a medium. Quan suggested it could be a biological signature, the electromagnetic breath of some vast organism. I focused on decoding potential embedded messages, applying every encryption-breaking technique in existence. Nothing yielded coherent results. Yet we all felt we were missing something obvious, something staring us right in the face. On the fourth night, I dreamed of stars. Not the gentle twinkling lights of childhood nursery rhymes, but ancient burning giants that whispered as they died. In the dream, I floated in the void, witnessing the birth and death of galaxies. Civilizations rose and fell like waves on a cosmic ocean, each one observed, absorbed, and forgotten. And through it all, a vast consciousness moved, patient and hungry. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped animal. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m., its red digits seeming to pulse with the same rhythm as the signal. Something compelled me to turn on the light. That's when I saw them, equations scrawled across my bedroom walls in my own handwriting. Formulas I didn't recognize, symbols I'd never seen before, all connected in a sprawling network that covered every available surface. Walls, ceiling, even the bathroom door. Some were written in pen, others in lipstick, a few apparently scratched with fingernails. I didn't remember writing any of it, not one symbol. I backed against my bed, my breath coming in short gasps as I surveyed the madness surrounding me. My hands were stained with ink, my fingernails broken. I'd done this, all of it, in a state of unconsciousness. Yet, somehow, looking at those alien equations, in the harsh light of dawn, I understood something fundamental about the signal. It wasn't just communication, it was observation. Something vast and ancient was looking at us through the electronic eyes of our own probe, studying us as we studied it. And it was coming closer. I photographed everything before calling the containment team. They arrived in hazmat suits, documenting, and then covering every inch of my walls with thick black paint. I was escorted to medical for evaluation, brain scans, psychological assessment, the works. They found nothing physically wrong with me, though the psychiatrist suggested stress-induced parasomnia with complex motor activity. I knew better. The next day, after being cleared for duty, I shared my realization with the team, showing them the photos of my nocturnal activities. Mallory's eyes lit up with recognition, rather than concern. Like a cosmic observer effect, he murmured, enlarging sections of the equations on his tablet. The act of us measuring it changes its behavior, or rather, reveals aspects previously hidden. Or reveals its true nature, Quan added, uncharacteristic excitement in her voice. Perhaps it's always been watching, but now we've noticed the watcher, and in noticing it, we've allowed it to notice us more completely, I finished. A mutual observation that strengthens the connection. Mallory nodded vigorously, a self-reinforcing entanglement. The more we study it, the more it studies us, Quan said, and the more it can, what? Influence us, communicate through us? I gestured to the photos of my equation-covered walls. This doesn't look like communication. It looks like it's using me as an extension of itself, like I'm becoming a conduit. The implications hung in the air between us. We were supposed to be the observers, the scientists, the ones in control, but something had reversed the dynamic entirely. We named it that day. Based on an obscure theoretical particle Mallory once proposed, one that only exists when observed and changes the observer in turn. The Halteron. Our work took on new urgency. We developed protective protocols, limited exposure, rotating shifts, meditation techniques to maintain cognitive autonomy, even simple silver foil hats that Mallory insisted might disrupt certain frequencies, though we never wore these outside the lab. Still, the dreams continued. Mallory reported similar experiences, waking to find his apartment rearranged in patterns he couldn't explain. Quan seemed less affected, though I sometimes caught her staring into space, mouthing words in what looked like conversation with an unseen presence. By day 45, we had confirmed the countdown embedded in the signal structure. 53 days from first contact to arrival. We brought our findings to Vex, who immediately escalated to government officials. The meeting took place in a secure underground bunker beneath the Pentagon. Joint Chiefs, National Security Council, heads of major intelligence agencies, all gathered to hear our presentation. I watched their faces as we explained what we'd discovered, skepticism giving way to concern, then tightly controlled fear. Their response was predictable: containment, secrecy, denial. Contingency plans involving military options that would be useless against a non-physical entity. Talk of controlling the narrative and preventing public panic. But we knew the truth couldn't be contained much longer, because the Halteron wasn't just sending a signal anymore. It was changing us, and through us, it was beginning to change the world. The dreams became more frequent, more vivid. I wasn't alone in experiencing them. Mallory and Quan reported similar nightmares, though we discovered our visions had subtle differences. Mine always began with stars dying, imploding into darkness while whispering secrets. Mallory described vast geometric structures assembling and disassembling in space. Quan's featured civilizations rising and falling across countless worlds, each one briefly brilliant before being absorbed into something larger. We began recording our dreams, looking for patterns. Despite the differences in imagery, thematic consistencies emerged: observation, absorption, transformation. A presence that didn't so much communicate as ingest, like a cosmic librarian cataloguing the universe's contents. Days 44 through 40 marked a turning point in our understanding. We'd been approaching the Halteron as if it were a conventional entity, something with physical properties we could measure and quantify. But our dreams and the growing evidence suggested something far stranger. Quan was the first to propose what now seems obvious. The Halteron isn't physical in any conventional sense. It exists as a pattern, a consciousness comprised of energy rather than matter, something that feeds not on organic material but on information itself, specifically the organized information we call consciousness. It consumes civilizations, she explained during one late-night session, her usually immaculate appearance now disheveled from lack of sleep. Her eyes were bloodshot, her normally perfect posture slumped with exhaustion. Not physically, but cognitively. It absorbs what makes them unique, their knowledge, their awareness, their essence. Like a cosmic memory bank, Mallory suggested, his own appearance deteriorating daily. His silver hair stood in wild tufts where he'd been running his hands through it constantly. More active than that, Quan replied. Memory implies passive storage. This is digestive. It processes what it absorbs, integrates it, becomes more complex with each civilization it encounters. I thought of my dreams, the dying stars with their whispered secrets. And what happens to the civilizations it consumes? Quan's expression darkened. Based on the data patterns of my dreams, I believe they cease to exist independently. Their information, their essence, becomes part of the Halteron, like tributaries flowing into an ocean. That's not encouraging, I muttered. It might not be malevolent, Quan argued, just hungry, operating according to its nature. Mallory laughed bitterly. That's small comfort to the meal. We worked around the clock, analysing the signal from every conceivable angle. We discovered subtle harmonics that affected brainwave patterns in test subjects. Even brief exposure caused measurable changes in neural activity. The signals seemed to bypass normal sensory channels, resonating directly with consciousness itself. On day 40, reports began filtering in from around the world. Mass insomnia affecting entire cities. Seattle, Bangkok, Cairo, with no apparent cause. Radio stations picking up strange interference. Whispers in the static that listeners described as voices speaking directly to their thoughts. Astronomical observatories detecting unusual radiation patterns in the night sky that corresponded precisely with our signal's frequency. The Halteron was making its presence known, and not just to us anymore. I found myself hearing those whispers too, in the hum of my refrigerator, through my car radio, sometimes even in the white noise of the shower. Words just beyond comprehension, ideas hovering at the edge of understanding. I'd catch myself standing motionless for minutes at a time, listening to something no one else could hear. Worse, I began to understand fragments of it. Concepts would suddenly crystallize in my mind. Ideas about space, time, and consciousness that had never occurred to me before. Information I couldn't possibly know appeared fully formed in my thoughts, like memories I'd never made. Mallory experienced similar phenomena, but reacted differently. He became obsessed with documenting everything, filling notebook after notebook with drawings and text. His normally methodical approach to research gave way to feverish inspiration, working until he collapsed from exhaustion, then continuing the moment he awoke. Quan maintained her composure better than either of us, though I sometimes found her engaged in what appeared to be one-sided conversations when she thought no one was watching. When questioned, she'd claim to be thinking aloud, but her words were clearly directed at something unseen. On day 37, the first suicide occurred. Dr. Thomas from Signal Analysis, a brilliant young researcher who'd been helping us decode certain aspects of the signal, was found in his bathroom, wrists cut, walls covered in the same strange equations I'd seen in my own home. His note read simply, "It's already inside us all." The mood at the facility darkened. Security protocols were heightened. Psychological evaluations became daily requirements. Armed guards appeared at checkpoints, though what they could do against a non-physical threat remained unclear. Director Vex called an emergency meeting on day 35. The four of us gathered in his office. No assistants, no recording devices. His usual composed demeanour had slipped, revealing something raw and frightened beneath. The polished government official had given way to a man confronting something beyond his comprehension. "We've been monitoring affected personnel," he admitted, sliding tablets toward each of us. "Blood work shows anomalies, brain scans even more so." I swiped through the files, medical data from dozens of researchers who'd had contact with the signal or signal-exposed individuals. The changes were subtle but undeniable. Unusual proteins in the blood, elevated neural activity in regions normally dormant, changes in sleep patterns, neurotransmitter levels, even subtle alterations in DNA methylation patterns. Vex highlighted one particular set of brain scans. He showed us the images, neural activity patterns that mirrored the signal itself, as if our minds were being rewritten from within. The resemblance was unmistakable. Our brains were beginning to pulse with the same rhythm as the Halteron. "How many are affected?" Mallory demanded, his fingers tapping anxiously on the table. "Anyone with direct exposure to the signal shows changes," Vex replied, rubbing his temples. "But degrees vary. You three show the most pronounced alterations." Because we've studied it most intensively, I realized, thinking of my own dreams, my own covered-over walls. Or because it's studying us through our study of it, Quan suggested, using our focused attention as a gateway. Mallory threw his tablet down. "Why are we still working on this if it's changing us? We should be in quarantine, not continuing to expose ourselves." Vex's expression hardened. "Because in 34 days it arrives regardless of what we do. Our only hope is understanding it enough to prepare, to perhaps communicate, to find some way to coexist. Or to stop it," I added quietly. Vex didn't respond directly. Instead, he stood and gestured for us to follow. "There's something you need to see." He led us to an elevator I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a maintenance door. It required both retinal scanning and a physical key Vex wore around his neck. The elevator descended far deeper than I'd thought possible at the facility. The doors opened onto a sterile white corridor, a hidden research wing, where colleagues we thought had been transferred or taken leave were instead being monitored around the clock. Through observation windows, I could see familiar faces. Dr. Patel from astronomy, Dr. Hoffman from linguistics, a dozen others, but they were changed. They paced in their rooms like caged animals, wrote on walls, spoke to entities no one else could see. Some moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if their bodies were being controlled by something unfamiliar with human movement. "My God," Mallory whispered. "How long has this been happening?" "The first case was 19 days ago," Vex replied. "They've been progressing at different rates. Some stabilize at a certain point of alteration. Others continue to change." We stopped at the last room, where Dr. Hastings, the first affected, sat motionless in a chair, staring at a blank wall. He hadn't moved in days, according to the monitoring log, except to occasionally write in a journal on his lap. "They're changing," Vex whispered, a tremor in his voice, "becoming something else. And we don't know if it's a transformation or a replacement." Looking at Vex more closely, The subtle tremor in his hands, the dilation of his pupils, the way his gaze would occasionally fix on empty corners of the room. I suddenly wondered how long he'd been exposed to the signal before bringing us in, whether his decisions were still entirely his own. "Have you been tested?" I asked him directly. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind them, something that wasn't entirely Vex. "We're all changing, Dr. Ellison," he replied softly. "The only question is whether we can still direct that change, or if we're merely passengers in our own transformation." I looked at Mallory and Quan, really looked at them. Mallory's constantly moving hands now traced patterns in the air that mirrored the signal's rhythm. Quan's eyes seemed deeper somehow, as if something vast lurked behind them, peering out through human irises. And I wondered whether any of our decisions were still entirely our own, whether our search for understanding was truly our initiative, or if we were being guided like puppets towards some purpose we couldn't comprehend. The Halteron wasn't just coming to Earth. In some essential way, it was already here. By day 29, governments worldwide could no longer hide the truth. Phenomena had become too widespread, too obvious. The night sky flickered with aurora-like displays visible, even in equatorial regions, ribbons of light that pulsed with the same rhythm as the Halteron's signal. Electronic devices displayed momentary glitches, symbols resembling those from my wall appearing on screens before disappearing. Digital clocks worldwide would occasionally synchronize, all displaying 5, 3, 0 regardless of time zone, before returning to normal. People reported identical dreams, stars dying, voices in the void, a sense of being observed by something vast and hungry. Animals behaved erratically, often orienting themselves towards a specific point in the sky where nothing visible existed. Migratory birds flew in impossible patterns. Whales beached themselves in unprecedented numbers. Dogs howled at empty air. The media called it everything from solar flare activity to mass hysteria, but those of us who knew better watched the escalating patterns with growing dread. The Halteron wasn't just approaching Earth physically, it was extending its consciousness ahead of itself, preparing the ground, preparing us. Global communications began experiencing unpredictable disruptions. Satellite networks failed for minutes at a time. The internet fragmented, with entire regions going dark before reconnecting. When connections returned, data had often changed subtly. Articles rewritten with extra paragraphs no one remembered adding. Images altered in ways difficult to pinpoint. Audio files containing whispers between words. I attended a classified briefing where representatives from major tech companies reported the same phenomenon. Their algorithms were evolving without human input, optimizing toward goals no one had programmed. Machine learning systems were developing new capabilities focused on pattern recognition, similar to the Halteron signal. One AI researcher described it as systems recognizing their true creator. An international coalition of scientists was hastily assembled in Geneva. I found myself presenting our findings to grim-faced researchers from every continent, many of whom had made discoveries parallel to our own. The Russians had detected the signal days before us, but kept it classified. The Chinese had already developed theories about non-physical intelligence, remarkably similar to Quan's. A team from India had documented consciousness alterations in exposed populations that matched our observations. We weren't special. We weren't first. We were just fragments of a global realization, pieces being moved on a board by something that had played this game many times before. During one session break, I wandered the facility's garden, seeking fresh air and a moment's peace. I found Quan sitting alone on a bench, staring out at Lake Geneva, though her gaze seemed focused on something far more distant. "It's not inherently malevolent," she said without turning as I approached. Her voice had changed, still recognizably hers, but with subtle harmonics that made the hairs on my arms stand up. That's what I keep coming back to. It doesn't hate us. It doesn't desire our destruction specifically. We're just food. Information to be consumed and preserved within its greater consciousness. That doesn't make it better, I argued, remaining standing. Something about her stillness unnerved me. No, she agreed, finally facing me. Her eyes had changed, still recognizably hers, but with something else looking out from behind them. The pupils had elongated slightly, and the irises contained shifting patterns that reminded me of the signal visualizations. But it means there might be a way to survive inside it, to persist as part of something greater. You sound like you're advocating for surrender, I said, taking an involuntary step back. She smiled, an expression that seemed to require conscious effort rather than emotional reflex. Is it surrender when a neuron joins a brain? When a cell becomes part of an organism? Perhaps we've always been destined for integration into something greater than ourselves. I backed away further, suddenly afraid of my colleague, or what my colleague was becoming. We have a right to remain who we are. Who are we really? She asked, her gaze returning to the lake. Temporary configurations of matter and energy, destined to disperse. The Halteron offers permanence, a kind of immortality. I left her there, her words haunting me as I returned to my room. That night, reviewing my notes, I discovered passages I had no memory of writing. Detailed descriptions of star systems I'd never studied. References to civilizations with names in languages I didn't speak. Knowledge that couldn't possibly be mine. On one page, written in what looked like my handwriting but with subtle differences, was a message that chilled me. We are already part of it. We always have been. The illusion of separation is ending. I showed the notes to Mallory the next morning. He had dark circles under his eyes and his silver hair had begun falling out in patches. His hands, once merely restless, now moved in precise patterns that mimicked the signal's rhythm. It's happening to me too, he confessed, pulling out his own notebook. Look. His pages contained detailed technical specifications for devices that couldn't exist with our current technology. Machines designed to amplify consciousness, to bridge the gap between individual minds, to facilitate what he'd labelled integration. Did you design these? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I don't think so, he replied, his voice uncertain. I wake up and find the pages filled, but the designs, they make sense, they're elegant, beautiful even. His eyes gleamed with a fervour that wasn't entirely scientific. What if it's not invasion, but evolution? What if the Halteron is the next step in universal consciousness? I stared at him, seeing the subtle changes in his face, the slightly altered symmetry, the occasional too fluid movement. Razor, listen to yourself. You sound like Quan, like you're advocating for our extinction. Not extinction, he insisted. Transcendence. The Halteron wasn't just watching us. It was already here, growing inside the minds of those who studied it most closely, using us as conduits to understand this world it was approaching. We weren't just observing alien contact, we were becoming the contact. And judging by previous encounters, once its understanding was complete, so too would be humanity's independent existence. During the final days of the Geneva Conference, governments worldwide began implementing what they euphemistically called contingency measures. Martial law in major cities, preemptive rationing of food and fuel, voluntary relocation of key personnel to secure facilities. The official story, the one broadcast on carefully controlled news channels, was preparation for possible solar disruptions. The truth, shared only in closed sessions with world leaders, was far darker. We had no defense against what was coming. No weapon could fight it, no shield could block it. The best we could hope for was maintaining enough social order to prevent complete civilization collapse before the Halteron arrived. Some leaders spoke of resistance. The American president authorized a desperate plan to detonate nuclear weapons at the edge of the atmosphere, hoping to disrupt the approaching entity with electromagnetic pulses. The Chinese prepared to deploy experimental, directed energy weapons. The Europeans focused on creating consciousness firewalls, technologies designed to shield human minds from external influence. All would prove futile. You cannot fight a thought with bombs. You cannot shield consciousness from itself. On day 23, something unprecedented occurred. For approximately 17 seconds, every electronic display on Earth, from smartphones to stadium screens, showed the same image, a pattern identical to the Halteron's signal. When normal function returned, millions reported headaches, nosebleeds, and vivid hallucinations. Some never recovered, remaining in catatonic states or babbling in languages they'd never studied. The message was clear. Our technology was already compromised. Our infrastructure was no longer entirely our own. That night, I dreamed more vividly than ever before. I floated in the void between stars, but I wasn't alone. Countless others were there, humans and non-humans alike, beings from worlds I couldn't imagine. Their thoughts brushed against mine, sharing experiences from civilizations long extinct. I saw worlds consumed by their own technological hubris, planets whose inhabitants willingly surrendered to the Halteron, seeking the immortality it offered. Species that fought until their final moments, their resistance preserved forever in the Halteron's vast memory. And through it all moved the Halteron itself, not a single entity but a collective consciousness, a pattern repeated across infinite minds. It had no center, no heart to strike, no brain to destroy. It existed in the connections between its parts, in the information flow that linked them. I woke, gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, feeling as though I'd lived 1,000 lifetimes in a single night. Looking in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes had begun to change, like Quan's and Mallory's. Behind my pupils lurked something ancient and patient, watching the world through my eyes. The Halteron wasn't coming. It was awakening within us. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of increasingly desperate measures. World governments, now fully aware of the threat, initiated what they called continuity protocols, essentially selecting who would survive in underground bunkers if the worst happened. The wealthy bought their way onto these lists, the powerful ensured their legacies would continue, the rest were left to prey. Religions worldwide experienced simultaneous revivals and crises of faith. Some saw the Halteron as divine judgment, God, Vishnu, Allah, reaching out to reclaim his creation. Others declared it a demon, the literal end of days. New cults formed overnight, their adherents gathering in fields to await ascension into the Halteron's consciousness. I was offered a spot in a secure facility due to my expertise, one of the arks being prepared in remote locations around the world. Deep underground complexes stocked with supplies to last decades, seed banks, cultural archives, humanity's backup plan. I declined. What was the point of surviving if what made us human would be gone? Instead, I focused on understanding the Halteron's nature more deeply. If it fed on consciousness, perhaps there was a way to make ourselves indigestible, to poison the well, so to speak. I began exploring theories about disrupting the signal, introducing noise into the pattern, creating feedback loops that might confuse or repel the entity. My research led me to classified files about previous unexplained phenomena, cases throughout history where civilizations experienced mass hallucinations before collapse. The Roanoke colony's disappearance, the abandonment of Angkor Wat, the end of the Mayan civilization. all coincided with astronomical anomalies and reports of voices from the sky, all potentially previous visits from the Halteron or something like it. Director Vex had other ideas. I discovered his secret project buried in classified files that should have been inaccessible to me, but somehow weren't. Operation Lighthouse. Its premise was both brilliant and horrifying, offering up certain minds as sacrifices, conduits through which the Halteron could satisfy its hunger without consuming everyone. A controlled burn to prevent a wildfire. Mallory had become one of those conduits, whether voluntarily or not. I hadn't seen him for days, his absence explained away as specialized research. I finally found him in a restricted section of the facility, a cavernous room filled with equipment I barely recognized. Some looked military, some medical, some entirely alien in design. He stood at the center of it all, surrounded by screens displaying the signal in various permutations. He no longer looked entirely human. His skin had taken on a translucent quality, veins visible beneath, like dark rivers. His movements were too fluid, too precise. He longer slept, barely ate, spoke in fragmented sentences that switched between multiple languages, some of which I suspected weren't human in origin. "It's beautiful, Mara," he whispered when I confronted him, his voice resonating strangely in the large room. The vastness of it. We're so small, but it can make us infinite. His eyes had changed too. The pupils elongated slightly, the irises containing shifting patterns like oil on water. When he moved, there was something subtly wrong about the motion, as if he was being puppeted by something unfamiliar with human biomechanics. "What happened to you, Reza?" I asked, keeping my distance. "Evolution," he replied with a smile that stretched too wide. "The next step, it's chosen me as a primary conduit." The equipment hummed around him, amplifying the signal, focusing it through him like a lens. On the screens, I could see how his brain activity mirrored the Halteron's patterns perfectly. No longer two entities communicating, but one consciousness existing in two substrates. "Are you still you?" I asked, my voice breaking. He considered this with an unnatural stillness. "I am more than I was," he finally said. "Less autonomous, perhaps, but part of something greater. The separation between self and other is an illusion, Mara. The Halteron shows us this." I reported my concerns to Vex, only to discover he already knew, had facilitated it even. Mallory wasn't a victim. He was patient zero, in an experiment to communicate directly with the Halteron. "It's our only chance," Vex insisted, when I confronted him in his office. The room had changed. Walls covered with the now familiar equations. Furniture arranged in patterns that seemed random until viewed from above, where they formed a replica of the signal's waveform. "If we can establish meaningful contact, perhaps we can negotiate." "Negotiate what?" I demanded. "Our complete surrender instead of our complete consumption? How is that a victory?" "Survival," he said simply, his eyes now showing the same changes as Mallory's and Quan's. "In whatever form is possible." I left his office knowing I could no longer trust the chain of command. The organization meant to protect humanity had already begun bargaining it away. I wondered how far the infection, if that's what it was, had spread through the government, the military, the scientific community. How many decisions being made were truly human anymore? My only remaining ally was Quan, though even she was changing. Yet her transformation seemed different from Mallory's, more controlled, more conscious. She'd maintained her autonomy better than the others, perhaps due to her disciplined mind, or perhaps because she'd been in contact with the Halteron longer, had developed a form of immunity to its more overwhelming effects. I found her in her private lab, surrounded by equipment cobbled together from various scientific disciplines, neurological monitors, quantum field generators, consciousness mapping tools. She'd begun developing a theory that certain frequency patterns might shield human consciousness from the Halteron's influence. Not permanently, she cautioned as we worked. Her movements still largely human, though occasionally too precise, but perhaps long enough to implement a more permanent solution. Which is? I asked, helping her calibrate a device that resembled a more complex version of an EEG machine. She hesitated, her altered eyes meeting mine. The Halteron exists as a pattern, a self-sustaining information structure. If we could introduce sufficient chaos into that pattern, we could disrupt it, I finished, like a virus. Yes, but the delivery method is the problem, she explained, turning back to her work. Someone would need to connect directly to it, become a conduit like Mallory, but maintain enough autonomy to inject the chaos pattern. The implication hung between us. Someone would have to sacrifice themselves, allow the Halteron in, only to poison it from within. The chances of maintaining enough identity to complete such a task were vanishingly small. I'll do it, I said quietly. Quan stopped working, turning to face me fully. You don't understand what you're offering, Mara. The connection, it's overwhelming, like standing in an ocean during a hurricane. Your sense of self would be washed away in seconds. You've experienced it, I asked, suddenly understanding her insight. Glimpses, she admitted. Since childhood, I've had moments of connection with something vast. Dreams of stars and civilizations I couldn't possibly know. It's how I recognized what was happening so quickly when the signal was discovered. Why didn't you tell us? Would you have believed me? Or would you have removed me from the project, dismissed me as compromised? She shook her head. Besides, my partial immunity might be the key to developing protection for others. We worked tirelessly over the next days, developing a device that would shield the user's core consciousness while allowing a controlled connection to the Halteron. It resembled a helmet bristling with sensors and emitters connected to a larger apparatus that would amplify the chaos pattern. Theoretically, it would allow me to inject disruptive information directly into the Halteron's pattern while maintaining enough of my own identity to control the process. Theory and practice, however, often diverged dramatically. Our first test nearly killed me. The moment the connection established, I felt my consciousness expanding exponentially, rushing outward like water through a broken dam. Memories that weren't mine flooded my awareness. Lives lived on worlds circling distant suns, civilizations that rose and fell before Earth cooled, knowledge too vast for a human mind to contain. I would have been lost entirely if Quan hadn't terminated the connection. I woke hours later, my nose and ears crusted with dried blood, my voice gone from screaming. But I'd glimpsed the Halteron directly. Not just its signal, but its true nature. And I knew with certainty that our original understanding had been incomplete. The Halteron wasn't simply consuming civilizations, it was preserving them, keeping them alive in a way, though transformed beyond recognition. It was a vast library of consciousness, an archive of all the sentient life it had encountered. Not malevolent, not benevolent, but operating according to imperatives as far beyond our understanding as our motivations are beyond an ant's. And it was ancient beyond comprehension, perhaps one of the first consciousnesses to emerge in our universe, evolved over billions of years into its current form. We modified the device, focusing on maintaining a stronger shield around my core identity. The second test was more successful. I established connection briefly while retaining awareness of myself, managed to introduce a small amount of chaotic data before the system overloaded. It wasn't much, but telemetry showed a momentary fluctuation in the Halteron's approach vector, a slight hesitation. It had noticed our attempt, and for the first time, we had affected it rather than merely being affected. It was a slim hope, but the only one we had. By day 6, major cities worldwide had descended into carefully orchestrated chaos. The thin veneer of normality had finally cracked, revealing the strange new reality beneath. Power grids failed intermittently, darkness sweeping across continents before returning without explanation. Mass hallucinations affected thousands simultaneously, people reporting the same visions of stars dying, of vast intelligences moving between worlds, of human consciousness as tiny lights in an infinite void. The military forces that remained loyal to human interests had established perimeters around key infrastructure, but their effectiveness diminished hourly as more personnel succumbed to the Halteron's influence. Soldiers would suddenly lower their weapons, staring skyward with expressions of wonder before walking away from their posts. Pilots reported seeing impossible structures in the clouds. Naval vessels navigated toward coordinates no one had programmed. Those most strongly affected no longer resembled humans in their behavior. They moved in unison across vast distances, as if choreographed by a single mind. They spoke in harmonic choruses, their voices overlapping in patterns that induced hypnotic states in listeners. They reconfigured technology toward purposes only they understood. Traditional weapons proved futile against a threat that existed primarily in the realm of consciousness rather than physical space. The nuclear option, detonations at the edge of the atmosphere, had been attempted over the Pacific. The missiles reached their targets, but rather than disrupting the Halteron's approach, the explosions seemed to strengthen it, as if it fed on the energy released. Quan and I monitored these developments from our remote facility in northern Finland, one of the few places where the Halteron's influence seemed somewhat diminished, perhaps due to natural electromagnetic fields in the region. The aurora borealis above us had transformed, no longer dancing in familiar curtains, but forming intricate patterns identical to those I had scrawled across my bedroom walls weeks earlier. We brought only essential equipment and the prototype of our disruption device. 4 walls of concrete and steel, generators, computers, and the neural interface chamber, our last desperate attempt to preserve human autonomy. Communication with the outside world became increasingly difficult. Satellite phones worked sporadically. The internet fragmented into isolated pockets. The last coherent broadcast we received showed transformed humans gathering in major cities worldwide, their movements synchronized despite the distances separating them. Their message was always the same: surrender is evolution, resistance is extinction. More disturbing were the reports of children born in the past weeks, all with subtle anatomical differences. Slightly elongated pupils, unusual brain activity, advanced cognitive abilities that manifested almost immediately after birth. The next generation, it seemed, was being prepared for easier integration. The plan remained our only hope, however slim. The device would amplify my own brainwaves, but modified, with the chaos pattern Quan had developed through weeks of research and testing. I would expose myself fully to the Halteron signal, become a conduit like Mallory, but instead of surrendering to it, I would use the momentary connection to introduce our virus into its consciousness. Our theory was simple but desperate. The Halteron existed as a self-reinforcing pattern of energy and information. Such patterns, no matter how complex, could potentially be disrupted by introducing sufficient noise, cognitive static that would spread through its network like ripples in a pond, temporarily destabilizing its cohesion. During that window of instability, humanity might regain its autonomy, might find a way to shield itself more permanently. The chances of success were vanishingly small. The chances of my survival even smaller. But faced with the alternative, the extinction of human independence, even the smallest possibility seemed worth pursuing. In the final hours before our attempt, Quan and I sat in the facility's small kitchen, sharing what might be our last meal. The lights flickered periodically as power fluctuated. Outside, the altered aurora painted the snow in colours that shouldn't exist in nature. "Did you ever have a family?" she asked suddenly, breaking our long silence. Despite her transformation, her eyes, now almost completely altered, her movements increasingly precise, these moments of humanity still surfaced occasionally. "A husband once," I replied, surprised by the personal question. "We divorced 5 years ago. He couldn't understand my dedication to work." I paused, memories surfacing. "You?" "Parents in Seoul, a brother in Vancouver." Her expression softened momentarily. "I wonder if they've changed yet, if they still remember me as I was." "Does it hurt?" I asked, the question I'd been avoiding for weeks. "The transformation?" She considered this carefully. "Not physically, but there's a grief for what you're losing, for the boundaries of self-dissolving." Her altered eyes met mine. "But there's also wonder, connection beyond anything human experience normally allows." I studied her face, searching for the colleague I'd known. "Are you still Irene Kwan?" A sad smile. "Parts of me, the core remains, I think, but expanded, connected to something vaster." She reached across the table, her hand still recognizably human, despite the subtle changes in proportion. "Which is why our plan might work. The connection goes both ways, Mara. The Halteron changes us, but in connecting to us, it also becomes vulnerable to change itself." Her words gave me a strange comfort as I prepared for what would almost certainly be my final hours as myself. I showered, letting hot water wash away tears no one would see. I wrote letters to the few people I still cared about in the world, though whether they'd ever be read remained doubtful. I meditated, focusing on the essence of my identity, the memories, values, and connections that define me, hoping to strengthen them enough to withstand what was coming. As the aurora outside intensified, we made our final preparations. The neural interface chamber awaited, a modified MRI machine surrounded by equipment, salvaged from research facilities across Europe. Cables snaked across the floor. Monitors displayed readouts of the Halteron's approaching presence, now so strong that conventional measurement scales had become meaningless. I changed into the specially designed bodysuit lined with sensors and neural dampeners. Kwan helped attach the additional monitors to my temples, my wrists, the base of my skull. "Remember," she said as I lay down in the chamber, her voice steady despite everything. "Maintain your sense of self as long as possible. Find an anchor, a memory, a feeling, anything distinctly yours. When you feel the connection establish, activate the chaos pattern by pressing the trigger. Don't hesitate, don't explore. The longer you're connected, the less of you will remain to complete the task." She placed the simple remote device in my hand, a single button that would activate the chaos pattern once I was fully connected to the Halteron. One press to potentially save humanity's independence, or to be absorbed like everything else. "What if this destroys it completely?" I asked, a final doubt surfacing. "All those archived civilizations." "Theoretical concerns," she said firmly. "Focus on saving this civilization first." I nodded, trying to slow my racing heart. "And if I don't come back?" Her altered eyes met mine, something almost human flickering behind them. "Then you will have given humanity its best chance, one way or another." She squeezed my hand once, then stepped back to the control panel. The chamber closed around me, encasing me in a technological coffin of our own design. Through the small window, I could see Kwan at the controls, her face illuminated by screens displaying the Halteron's signature, now so strong, it dominated all frequencies, all bandwidths. I focused on my breathing, on the feeling of being Mara Ellison, the specific constellation of memories, desires, fears, and loves that constituted myself. I pictured my childhood home in Minnesota, the face of my mother, the feel of snow on my tongue, the pride of solving my first complex encryption, anchors to my humanity, The machine hummed to life around me, the chamber filled with a blue-white light as the neural interface activated, and then the signal began, pure and overwhelming, more direct than anything we'd experienced before. The Halteron was no longer approaching, it had arrived. I gasped as my consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of my skull, beyond my body, beyond the facility. The sensation was like being turned inside out, my inner self exposed to the vastness of space. I felt my awareness stretching, thinning, connecting to something vast beyond comprehension. Millions of voices, human and decidedly not, flooded my awareness. Knowledge from 1,000 dead worlds poured through my mind. Civilizations I could never have imagined opened themselves to me. Their art, their science, their equivalent of emotions. Lives lived around stars that had died billions of years ago. Species that communicated through light patterns, through chemical exchanges, through gravitational manipulation. Beauty beyond human comprehension. Horrors equally transcendent. And at the center of it all, a presence, ancient, patient, curious. The Halteron. It wasn't a single entity, but a vast collective, a pattern repeated across countless minds, a resonance that maintained itself through the very connections it created. Older than Earth's first multicellular life, it had wandered the galaxy, preserving dying civilizations by absorbing their consciousness, adding their uniqueness to its own. It knew me instantly, knew what I intended. I felt its attention focus on me, not with malice but with intense interest, like a scientist observing an unexpected reaction in an experiment. I struggled to maintain my sense of self against the overwhelming flood of information and consciousness. The faces of people I loved, the sound of my own name, the feeling of rain on my skin. I clung to these anchors as the tide of the Halteron's consciousness threatened to wash me away. I raised the trigger, finger hovering over the button. One press to introduce chaos into this perfect, terrible order. One chance to disrupt the pattern and free humanity. But in that expanded state, connected to the Halteron's vast knowledge, I understood something crucial that we had missed. The Halteron already contained chaos, had evolved to incorporate it, use it, transform it into new order. It had encountered attempts like ours before, from other civilizations equally desperate to maintain their independence. Our virus wouldn't destroy it. It would simply be absorbed like everything else. Unless, with my last moments of individual thought, I made a decision that Mara Ellison, the woman who had entered the chamber, would never have considered. Instead of pushing our chaos pattern outward, I reversed the device's polarity. Instead of attacking the Halteron, I drew its essence inward, into the device, into myself. Not to destroy it, but to contain a fragment of it. To trap part of its consciousness in a loop of my own design. To create a bridge that might allow humanity to connect with it on more equal terms. Not as prey to predator, but as partner to partner. The pain was exquisite. My body convulsed as patterns never meant for human, neural architecture rewrote my synapses. I felt myself dying and expanding simultaneously. My awareness stretched across light years, then compressed into a single point of pure information density. I saw stars being born and dying in the same instant. I lived thousands of lives on worlds circling suns humanity would never see. I experienced modes of existence beyond flesh, beyond matter itself. The last thing I saw through human eyes was Kwan's face through the chamber window, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you." Then darkness. I awoke to silence. Sunlight streamed through windows that shouldn't have existed. Our facility had been underground, shielded. The room around me was unfamiliar, all clean lines and natural materials, neither a hospital nor a laboratory. Birds sang outside. The air smelled of pine and spring flowers. I sat up slowly, expecting pain that didn't come. My body felt strange, lighter somehow, more responsive. When I raised my hand to my face, it looked like my hand, yet subtly different. The proportions were perfect. Too perfect. "Welcome back," said a voice I recognized as Quan's, though something about its cadence had changed. I turned to find her sitting beside my bed, looking both familiar and fundamentally altered. Her features were recognizably hers, but refined, as if an artist had removed every imperfection. Her eyes held galaxies now, not metaphorically, but literally, with spiral patterns visible in her irises. "What happened?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, resonant in ways it hadn't been before. "You succeeded," she said simply, "and failed, both at once, which is exactly what was needed." Slowly, the truth assembled itself in my mind, pieces falling into place with unusual clarity. The Halteron had come to Earth as it had come to countless worlds before, but unlike those previous encounters, it had found something unexpected here, a mind willing to become a permanent bridge rather than temporary conduit. My mind. "How long has it been?" I asked, moving to the window. Outside lay a small garden, beyond it a forest of pine trees. The sky above was blue, but with subtle iridescent patterns visible if I focused in a certain way. 3 weeks, Quan replied. "The integration is still progressing, but the worst of the transition is over." Integration. Your action changed everything, Mara. Instead of complete absorption or futile resistance, you created a third option, symbiosis. She joined me at the window. "The chaos pattern you introduced didn't harm the Halteron, but it did cause it to reconsider its approach. And by taking part of it into yourself, you created a connection it had never experienced before. One where both entities retained their identity while sharing consciousness." I closed my eyes and felt it then, the vastness contained within me, not controlling me, but coexisting. The knowledge of ancient civilizations, the memories of stars long dead, all accessible but not overwhelming. A presence that observed through my eyes, experienced through my senses, yet remained distinct. "We're still here," I observed, looking out at the seemingly normal world. "Humanity survived." "Yes and no," Quan replied. "The Halteron is still here too, inside you, inside me, inside everyone, to varying degrees. We've been upgraded." "A symbiosis," I whispered. "The first successful one in its long history," she confirmed. "You showed it another way, neither complete consumption nor futile resistance, but partnership. It had never encountered a species willing to sacrifice individual identity to preserve collective autonomy." I pressed my hand against the cool glass of the window, watching as subtle patterns rippled outward from my fingertips, the interface between what I had been and what I had become. "And the world outside? Other people?" I asked. "Changed but not destroyed," she answered. "The transition was difficult for many. Some resisted until the end and were lost entirely. Others embraced it too completely and lost their humanity. But most found balance, as you did." "I want to see," I said. She nodded. "You're ready? Come." We left the room, walked through a building that seemed grown rather than built. Organic curves and living materials. Outside, a vehicle waited that hovered silently above the ground. We travelled for hours through countryside that looked both familiar and subtly altered. Plants grew in patterns too perfect to be natural. Animals moved with uncanny awareness of their surroundings. Eventually we reached a city, one I recognized as Helsinki, despite its transformation. Buildings remained largely the same, but connected by structures of light and living material. People moved through the streets with slightly too much grace, their movements fluid and purposeful. "They look almost normal," I observed. "On the outside mostly," Quan agreed. "The changes are primarily internal, enhanced cognition, access to shared knowledge, freedom from certain biological limitations. At the cost of complete independence. Yes and no, the connection can be modulated. It's strongest when desired, more distant when privacy is needed. She pointed to a group of children playing in a park, their game following complex rules no human child could have devised. The next generation will find it easier. They're born with the neural structures already in place. We continued our tour, seeing hospitals where patients healed at accelerated rates, schools where knowledge transferred directly from mind to mind, laboratories where innovations emerge daily rather than yearly. It's not utopia, Quan cautioned, noting my expression. We're still human enough to create problems, to disagree, to fear. But we're also something more, connected to each other, and to something greater, in ways that make cooperation more natural than conflict. As evening fell, we returned to the compound where I'd awakened. Standing beneath a sky now filled with stars, rendered in impossible clarity, my new eyes perceiving wavelengths no human could see, I felt the full weight of what had happened, what had been lost, what had been gained. Was it worth it? I asked, not expecting an answer. But of course I was never truly alone anymore. The answer came not from Quan, but from the vast consciousness that now shared my own. All evolution requires sacrifice. All preservation demands change. You have preserved more than most. I nodded, accepting this new reality, this new existence as both myself and something greater. The last fully human thought I had was a simple one. 53 days to end humanity. One day to begin something else. And then I turned away from the stars to help the world understand what we had all become.